Good morning, one and all. Good to be back again in your pulpit. Initial thanks to Gary for the music chosen after some discussion with him this week. Each of those three pieces relates in one way or another to the theme. The Ode to Joy of Beethoven is the text by Schiller is prophetic of a time of joy when people come together. The prophet, I'm speaking about the prophetic theology of James Luther Adams. As I mentioned, in theological school, he tells, Adams was a great storyteller. Theological school, you could, at the final exam, you could get away with it if you said that a prophet is one who prophesies doom. Well, you could get away with that, but there was also the joyful prophecy, which you hear in that music. The chorale tune, Wacht auf, arranged by Bach, which is in one of the old hymnals, thanks to Adams, who said that the Unitarians should know the classic music of the Christian and Protestant tradition, and that's one example which you found in the older hymnals, which Adams himself influenced. Adams had this influence on Unitarianism throughout a good bit of the 20th century. His life spanned the century from 1901 to his death in 1994. And the Bartok chorale, which was also played, is a piece to whom I've written words. Bartok was not known as a hymn writer, but he did write in the midst of the concerto for orchestra that beautiful chorale tune, which wrote words to then, which is in the current hymn for the what is it called? Hymns for the no. That's what it's called? Thank you. Singing the Living Tradition. It doesn't appear in the other one. That was in 1964. Okay. The thing about a lot of incidental chat is that we need to move along to the sermon itself, beginning now with a biblical epigraph. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of the world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6:12. Liberalism is dead. Long live liberalism. James Luther Adams arrested attention, as he was so good at doing, with this opener to a midlife essay, playing off the ancient announcement of the king is dead, the monarch's demise, and the rise with no space in between for an interloper. When the old ruler is gone, the dynasty itself renews itself. So too the dynasty of liberalism. Deep discontent with the religious liberalism that Adams found in his adopted denomination going back to the 1920s. The Unitarians, his adopted denomination, that led him to become its strongest critic. Both its secular humanist and its liberal Christian branches he saw as caught in a cultural lag. His phrase. His theology lays the intellectual groundwork for a new religious liberalism, transformed in ways that carry it beyond its Enlightenment-formed consciousness a consciousness prioritizing the rational, the universal, and the individual. In his postmodern version, these priorities become respectively the voluntary, the historical, and the communal. I've noted some of these terms because there are so many of them on that sheet of paper so that they wouldn't go by completely in a moment from the air. So the shift from modern, or what's sometimes called enlightenment, to a postmodern thought is closely related to the shift from liberal to a liberationist orientation in theology. Adams did not discuss specifically the liberation theology movement which arose initially in South America. He did not discuss it as such. Nevertheless, his thought very much shifts reflects this shift in consciousness. An example of what this means illustrates the difference. Namely, the contemporary issue which we've all heard talked about of equality versus equity. The liberal principle of human equality, Thomas Jefferson's declaration that all men are created equal, stands as an unqualified principle, here taking men as people, degenderizing Jefferson, but absent a commitment, but equality, absent a commitment to actualize and universalize it as equity, can become an empty slogan and can then feed cynicism. The two concepts stand in dialectical relationship then. Equity authenticates commitment to equality. To be sure, Adams did not discount the intellectual achievement of the Enlightenment, nor abandon its core commitments. He cited the spirit of the Enlightenment as captured so wonderfully by Immanuel Kant. Sapere aude, dare to think. And Adams's persistently dialectical vision includes then rethinking the meaning of liberalism itself. Liberals, like the adherents of any great historical tradition, must read the signs of the times and respond critically and creative. Adams's entire early studies led him to conclude that time is the essence of God and humanity. He developed a theology then that does not avoid the dust and heat of his human history, but rather that takes time seriously. He named it prophetic theology. Three nets then to capture this protean thinker, Adams. Adams maintained voluminous correspondence with colleagues, inquirers and friends. He also was erudite and famously shared his vast learning with students and colleagues who wrote him, and he would always respond. He was a man of robust ego. He enjoyed telling that it was said he believed in salvation by bibliography. He had read his way through whole libraries. Just so his thought was consistently developed in response to the thought of others. He could be scathing towards simplistic and individualistic religion, especially fundamentalism, in which he had grown up, to be sure. He knew it well. And also self-centered pietism, exemplified, by the hymn, he walks with me and talks with me and tells me I am his own, that kind of pietism. But as a teacher, he more often expressed his own curiosity and his delight in the creative work of others. Now, isn't that interesting? He would exclaim in a lecture. And then he would expound on the virtues of creativity, as he would say, breaking out of the grooves of convention. He recalled, for instance, Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher, telling how the young John Maynard Keynes, the economist, left Cambridge University not as expected for academia, but for London. He would return to academia, Keynes declared, but first he would make 2 or 3 million pounds in the stock market. And then, with high piping voice, Whitehead declared, and by George, he did it. Adams admired the audacity of his namesake, Martin Luther, who said, supposedly, sin boldly that grace may abound. Think about it. Being once asked then, are you a Tillician or a Whiteheadian? Adams replied, there is always Trelch. These are the names which I put on that piece of paper. The Protean, Adams, was not to be caught in any single net. Many thinkers influenced Adams, but Paul Tillich, Ernst Trelch, and Alfred North Whitehead became central to his 3 major contributions to the development of contemporary theological thought. First, Adams was a major translator and interpreter of Paul Tillich, who was, I believe, many would agree, was the most intellectual and the most influential liberal and existential theologian of the 20th century. Adams was especially affected by Tillich's early German writings on religious socialism and the interpretation of culture and history. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Tillich at the University of Chicago shortly after Tillich had emigrated to the United States to escape Nazism. In 1956, Adams became Tillich's colleague at Harvard Divinity School. Tillich said of Adams, probably without exaggeration, he knows more about my writings than I do myself. Represents in his whole being a warning against a theology that sacrifices the prophetic to the mystical element. Though both of them, as he and I would agree, are essential to religion generally and to Christianity especially. Indeed, Adams saw the prophetic and the mystical elements as standing in constant dialectical tension. He likewise affirmed unity in diversity, another expression of this dialectical idea. But he cautioned against thinking that diversity of belief is a good caution for religious liberals. Do not think that diversity of belief can ever be overcome in time and history. Diverse belief cannot be resolved by authoritarian leaders in church or state, or in Boston, or reduced to a single legal contract or any conformist demand without anti-democratic repression. Being keenly aware of the way in our inherited religious language has become brittle and lifeless with the passage of time, of centuries indeed, Adams credited Paul Tillich with generating a new religious vocabulary, a vocabulary capable of speaking to contemporary consciousness in new ways. For instance, Tillich's God is not a being, but by turns, being itself, an ontological term, or the ground of being, a metaphorical term, and also the God above the God of theism. How can that be? He says this at the end of his Tillich's probably most popular book called The Courage to Be. The God The God who, he speaks of the God who appears when the God of theism has disappeared in anxiety and doubt. These three expressions for God reflect them respectively, as I said, the ontological and symbolic and existential modes of atoms. Second, then, atoms contributed to an understanding of the close relationship between theological and social ideals, reflected in the basic historical forms of religious organization and ethical commitment. His intellectual mentor in this development was Ernst Troeltsch, a German scholar and historical liberal, closely associated with the sociologist Max Weber. Troeltsch is best known for his typology, his religious typology of different groups of church, sect, and mystical types. These forms of religious organization correlate then with the kind of religious and ethical and political systems of belief. The whole connection between religion and society is brought out in his social ethics. Troeltsch also wrestled with the challenge posed by modern historical consciousness, that if everything changes, as we know, then everything is relative. And what can you believe in if everything is relative? The relativism born of modern day skepticism can only be met then by a faith that accepts the evolution of religious ideas and ethical ideals into its very system, or indeed which incorporates this recognition into its vision of humanity and human history. A glass of water here for me. Third, then, going on to the third of those triumvirate of mentors, Adams sought to reground liberal religious thought in the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, one of his teachers at Harvard. Also, Charles Hartshorne, closely related to Whitehead in his thought. Hartshorne was a colleague at Chicago and a close friend, and also for a certain time a parishioner of mine in the Austin, Texas UU Church. In Whitehead's theology is a kind of what is called panentheism, or temporal theism. God is not timeless. God is not Aristotle's unmoved mover, but rather symbolizes the transcendent directive in time. In this view, God is the leading edge of creative advance in Whitehead's thought, suggesting an ultimately optimistic view of the human condition. Adams celebrated Whitehead's own creative advance. He also cautioned, though, against philosophical harmonism, that is, discounting the persistence of difference and conflict in human history. The high abstraction of Whitehead's thought, he said, lacked seasonal relevance, social, political relevance of today. Again, Adams is hard to pin down. He enjoyed telling the story, as I mentioned before, that you could get away with it in theological school if on the final exam you said, well, a prophet is one who proclaims doom. A generation later, though, Adams's own students dubbed Adams the smiling prophet, genial storyteller that he was. Despite his strictures against harmonism and historical optimism, Adams's writing and his own winning personality seem to reflect the Whiteheadian vision of transcendence in and through time. Time, he said, is of the essence of God and humanity. He was also, matter of fact, a quondam professor of English composition at Boston University in his very career. And he liked to speak on the uncommon voice, the optative. So English majors, you know what the optative voice is, the wishful voice. Within these broad areas of Adams' intellectual work, we find a radical turn toward a theology that arises from and calls for engagement in the communal and historical dimensions of human existence. We might consider then three themes closely related to these intellectual companions, Tillich, Trelch, and Whitehead, simplifying the complex a great deal. Themes that are central to Adams's thought: prophetic faith, radical laicism, and covenant as a fundamental or root metaphor for interpreting existence. The latter two of that trio is what I'm going to speak at. That comes in part 2 of this sermon. Here, sticking to prophetic faith, that is, reading the signs of the times. Adams's thought is rooted in his personal quest for a theology that takes time seriously. One of his famous phrases. A theology that he came to identify with the prophetic tradition of the Bible. He locates its contemporary emergence in the radical critique initiated by Karl Barth, among others, of the culture religion embraced by liberal Christianity in the 19th century. Adams had seen from his experience in parish ministry the importance of maintaining a certain critical distance from the dominant culture. He describes Karl Barth as literally interrupting the meeting. Another one of these phrases Adams came up with. Interrupting the meeting. And in an incident that happened at a theological conference in 1936, Barth rose to protest at this conference, then with, as he says, naive acceptance by the moderator who let him in, the presiding chair, what Barth protested against what he called the birth of no God, the idolatry of devotion to culture-bound social and moral assumptions, not the living God of history. And of course, this is the very era in which Nazism is brewing in Europe. One of the things that drew Adams to travel in Europe and at that time. Adams clearly admires Barth's audacity again, deftly deployed in Barth's own campaign to alter the course of Christian theology, interrupting the meeting, protesting the unquestioned social consensus is what prophets do, speaking in the name of the divine spirit at work in history. Adams goes on, however, to reject Karl Barth's anti-philosophical stance. It ruled out any form of natural theology or universal faith in the name of a neo-Reformation interpretation of Scripture as the whole basis of Christianity. Barth called his culture negating theology dialectical, interestingly, but Paul Tillich's theology, Adams said, is more authentically dialectical on account of its nuance, yes and no, to culture. Tillich, he said, insisted upon a discriminating judgment and responsibility over against merely bringing everything into a abstract negative cipher. To take time seriously is to discern the spirit, not only in the religious, but in the secular movements of social reform. Adams could be scathingly critical of Christian existentialists like Soren Kierkegaard and Rudolf Bultmann, who focused on the interior life of the individual, academic matrix of personal and communal life. Nevertheless, Adams affirmed the existential turn of 20th century thought as foundational to a prophetic theology. The existential thesis focuses then on what? The concrete, the real, and the contingent. Placing these key concepts in dialectical relationship to the abstract. So the concrete and the abstract stand always in relation to each other. The real stands in relation to the ideal, and the contingent stands in relationship to the necessary. Dialectical relations are not oppositional, but rather polar. They stand in dynamic tension, and therefore they also mark periods of change. Paul Tillich's existentialism drew on the thought of Friedrich Schelling, early 19th century German philosopher, who drew in turn on the 16th century theosophist Jakob Böhme. Their existential dialectic sees the radical discontinuities in history and bids us to respond with courageous decision. History moves in this vision, not so much by smooth progression as in the liberal idea of progress. You remember there was a day when the Unitarians spoke of the progress of mankind, onward and upward forever, as a fundamental belief. But rather than that idea of a smooth progression, but history moves by widening tensions, which are then bridged, here taking Böhme's imagery as by sparks of the divine spirit, a veritable Jacob's ladder rising from heaven to earth, or descending, or both. The significance of Tillich as an interpreter of history and culture is most clearly seen in the major essays that Adams translated and then published in a book by him called The Protestant Era. Concepts developed in connection with Tillich's religious socialism entered then into Adams's critique of liberal theology's attenuated concepts of evil and of grace, terms that liberal theologies had difficulty with. Tillich helps reconnect with these fundamental religious concepts. So Tillich spoke of the demonic and of structures of destruction, as inviting recognition of the reality and the historical force of evil. Still, as Adams notes, pure or satanic evil is a myth that often feeds superstition. Real evil is demonic, a radical self-justifying distortion of what is fundamental, the created good. Tillich's use of the terms kairos, the Greek term for opportune or right time, as in the time of a harvest, comes at the kairos, the right time, and his use of the term the gestalt of grace, the form of grace. These provide positive concepts then for the actualization or fulfillment of the good in time and history. In Adams's prophetic theology, faith is not only a critical principle resisting cultural idolatries. In his prophetic theology, faith is also a formative power, calling us to redeem the time, the kairos, and to generate gestalt forms to grace. Prophetic theology, obligation to interpret in the light of the kingdom of God. It embodies the eschatological orientation that Adams called for in theology, an orientation toward ends. Thus effectively transforming liberal into a liberating theology. He writes, in response to the living God, prophetic theology releases what is not ultimately within its power, not within our control. The moving, reforming, transforming element in history of religion and culture. Unquote. God, the community forming power at work into nature, Dave's words, of justice.